Welcome to Filtering versus Graphics. My name is Timothy Lattis, and this is the Neo-Kino Graphics channel. So the big question, what is required for perfect filtering in the worst case content? Let's break this down. Worst case as in I don't want variable quality based on content. Second thing, perfect filtering, as in no aliasing and no moire, either spatially or temporally. Effectively, anything visible will be persistently visible regardless of subpixel positioning on the screen. Thus, this talk is going to be testing just the worst case. Subpixel motion of a full contrast white fence around Nyquist against a black background. To follow along, please load the associated shader toy. I'm not going to show the live view in this talk. Due to the compression of video, it probably is not going to transfer properly. Note that shader toy does support zoom. This thing has a moving black and white fence, and there's a frequency gradient. Frequency on the leftmost side is an 8 pixel period. It's very easy to reproduce that at any subpixel position. Then we have a green area in the middle. This is the safe zone. It's 4 pixel period. Also easy to reproduce at any phase. And we have the Nyquist, the 2 pixel period region. That is the red one. Next we have some Nyquist and safe zone reference rows. So the green one is half Nyquist frequency. It is a green fence. It's rendered without filtering. Then we have the Nyquist red fence. This is peak visibility. This is pixel aligned posts. This one also is stationary. Then the first row. This is the no anti-aliasing row. This would be what you get if the GPU rendered the fence with triangles. Everything snaps to pixels. If you take a paused view, it kind of looks like a piano in a sense, where sometimes the black area is bigger than the white area, sometimes the white area is bigger than the black area. It's very hard to understand what's going on here visually, especially in the safe to Nyquist region. The flow actually looks like it reverses near the safe line. That area is mostly non-moving, except for it snaps every once in a while. The following row is 4x MSAA raster with a box filter, i.e. what traditional graphics used to be. You only get 4 steps of subpixel motion, so you get a lot of temporal flicker past the safe region all the way down to the blue area, especially if it's a non-calibrated display. If you look at the safe to Nyquist region, it is dominated by a spatial temporal moire. So 4 samples per pixel is not enough to do much justice there. And then the Nyquist region now has a different behavior. It actually phases in and out. So it'll phase between being able to see the fence, meaning see the black and see the white, repeating, to seeing gray. We move up to 8x MSAA raster with the box filter. This is getting substantially better in the lower frequencies. However, it will not fix the problems of temporal flicker between the safe and Nyquist region. This next row represents the converged box filter behavior on infinitely future hardware that we will never get, effectively 128 sample MSAA, which doesn't exist, and then resolved with a box filter in linear. You notice the Nyquist region now phases the fence in and out very cleanly, and you get rings of similar behavior in the neighboring regions. So the critical point this far. One cannot solve the temporal flicker problem simply by introducing more MSA samples. Note that TAAs, ML or not, that converge to pixel box filter MSAA-like sharpness will also have the same problem. Also, sharpeners like CAS, RCAS, DCAS, and copies, these are using a 5-tap sharpening kernel, and thus are Nyquist amplifiers, amplifying detail that could never be temporally stable. And this is by design, because it's actually the wrong way to solve the problem. CAS basically amplifies the cheating, and one would never use CAS on something like a CG film, for instance. So next topic, let's dive into seeing what we can and cannot do with noise, or film grain. In this row, the top half is the noise. This is the default blue noise in shader toy. The bottom half is 4x MSAA box filter. And this version is now overlaid with the noise. And you'll notice that the noise, or the film grain, overlaid does not mask the temporal flicker. Also note this is at maximum amount of grain that you could potentially put in a signal. Now the next row shows that you can trade grain for sample count though. So what I mean by that is this is still a 4x MSAA box filter. However, the sample position in the box has a blue noise offset, and then they are evenly distributed. Now you notice from a temporal flicker perspective, this looks closer to the 128x MSAA case, in that it kills temporal flicker in the lower frequencies. It changes the temporal flicker for grain. However, the grain is not stable in the Nyquist region. It now phases between seeing peak grain and seeing the fence. So one might ask, what happens if we change from a box filter to something like a Lankos? in this case a Lynkos 2. This row is doing 32x anti-aliasing with a 4 pixel wide kernel, and there is no jitter on this line, or no noise. There is a little bit of cheating in here in that this is already peak contrast, and Lynkos will push it below 0 and above 1. It's just being clipped, so it's not full energy conserving. You'll notice that we're in the Nyquist area, we're getting the same behavior that we got with the box filter. So we can't necessarily solve it by keeping peak frequency filter like Lynkos 2. Lynkos 2 is a perfect resampling kernel in many respects. It's imperfect in that its length is truncated. Another option is we start to move to filters that do some amount of low pass behavior. In this case, we have a 128x AA cubic B-spline. This one has no negative lobes. It's a 4 pixel wide kernel, and it is starting to cut out the frequencies around Nyquist. And therefore, it starts to suppress the temporal flicker. This last row is doing a 128x AA double wide Lynkos 2. Double wide as in the kernel is stretched twice as wide, so instead of being a 4 pixel kernel, it is now an 8 pixel wide kernel, and it is doing some amount of low pass. Enough low pass that the Nyquist region is effectively gone, so no longer seeing any phasing in and out of the fence. It's now fully temporally stable because it's always missing. One of the compromises of using this filter is now the safe area is effectively half contrast from what you saw with the box filter. So what's the takeaway this far? You can't get rid of temporal flicker or temporal moire without also getting rid of the detail near the Nyquist frequency range. And thus this has one big side effect. Edge gradients will always be multi-pixel wide. They're never going to be single pixel like a box MSAA filter would provide. So if we were to look into why do game graphics look uncanny and why do they look gamey, part of this is because they have an impossible MTF or modulation transfer function. Typically, you'd see this graphed for a lens with a sensor, and in real-world video capture, there is a contrast fall-off in the high frequencies. Game graphics has more of a square MTF when things are pixel aligned, and then depending on the subpixel alignment, that will phase between this square MTF and something that has some amount of fall-off near Nyquist. And that is why game graphics looks highly uncanny. We go back to the 1980s, during the advent of CG film. There's nothing sharp about early CG. They correctly applied filtering to remove temporal aliasing. Fast forward to modern times, the GPUs later introduced an era of compromised filtering, an era that we have never really recovered from. So what about today's CG and film standards? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at what is arguably, in modern times, some of the highest quality visuals mixing CG graphics and film. And that would be the Dune 2021 movie. This movie is completely seamless and visually immersive. It has distraction-free rendering everywhere. There is no moire, and there is absolutely no temporal flicker. So let's take a look at what it looks like downsampled to 1080p on a Blu-ray capture. I'll give you a hint. There's no Nyquist frequency detail. Here we go. Here's the zoom. Notice there's nothing that is pixel frequency down here. Here's another one. This one a little bit more detailed. You can look at the characters in the background. There's nothing of pixel frequency there, and the characters that are closer up, same thing. So what would it take to take a film like Dune and make it look like PC graphics? Well, we can do this. We basically do a nearest downsampling where we cut each axis in half. So we're doing a 4 times area reduction without any kind of filtering. We just decimate it. And you'll notice the background here on the right-hand side, you can see what the actual capture looks like. All the edges have roughly a gradient that's about 2 pixels in radius. And if we look at the other side, the decimated side, now it starts to look at what people want with their PC graphics. Something that has a lot of detail around Nyquist and edges that have gradients that are only 1 pixel wide. So what about gaming today? I'd say we're kind of floating between two extremes. On one extreme, we render in ultra low resolution, we add DLSS, etc., and this is far from good. It's quite sloppy. On the other extreme, we render in ultra high res, and we have uncanny sharpness via that impossible MTF. Another problem is that we have visually inconsistent detail everywhere at 4K, typically. You have Nyquist detail on geometric triangle edges at peak contrast. You have a mix of low-resolution textures and high-resolution textures inside the triangles. There's different resolution in shadows, and reflections, and transparency. There's a different quality in disocclusions versus the temporally converged regions. Let's look at some examples. This one is from what the Game Awards called the Graphics Game of the Year. This shot is from DSOG. It is showing low frequency and over sharpened, and it's radically different than CG. This one from Black Myth Wukong. What you see here is you see relatively low frequency on the textures inside the triangles, but then on triangle edges you see Nyquist frequency response. This looks very unnatural. Here's another one from the same shot. You get peak contrast along the tree limbs, and these are all at Nyquist frequency. Here's another example of the frequency mismatches from the same image. Let's keep in mind that some games did do it right. This is from the Order 1886. They had very coherent, high-quality visual language throughout the whole game. I'd also say that the path out of the Uncanny Valley actually matters a lot. For example, with FXAA, it defaulted to dropping pixel frequency contrast. This was closer to a real-world film MTF in theory, but in practice it had extremely inconsistent visual language. Edges were actually still at Nyquist, and then inside textures they were slightly below Nyquist, and then subpixel detail still was pixel snapping in motion. The visual contrast between all these extremes did not look that good, in my opinion. If we want to get closer to CG quality, it implies doing everything right and doing it consistently across all aspects of the visual language. So transcending the Uncanny Valley. There is no exit from the Uncanny Valley with detail at Nyquist. If we want to go distraction-free, that requires readdressing filtering in the modern times. Specifically, fading off the frequency response around Nyquist, and removing the divide between geometric and in-surface edges. This talk explored the impossible setup, 128 samples per pixel. Venturing into the practical is a topic for another time.